I'm here to ask Stephen Greenblatt to talk about this wonderful book he's written about Christopher Marlowe. And I think that Christopher Marlowe may not be as well known to this audience as he is in England. But let's start the story at the end, Stephen. So tell us, please, what happened that day in Deptford.
This is a spoiler alert. I hate to give it away, but since Lucy asked me, on May 30th, 1593, a group of men went to spend the day together in Deptford, which is at that time a port. Now it's just part of London on the Thames. They went to Widow Bull's Tavern, and there they met at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they stayed for lunch. And then they walked around in the garden outside the tavern for the afternoon, and then they went back in for dinner. And then after dinner, the servants who were outside the room heard voices being raised. They were very loud. And they came into the room, and there was a man lying dead on the floor with a knife stuck through his eye. And that was Christopher Marlowe. He was 29 years old. He was an extraordinary and famous, perhaps notorious playwright and poet with a very complicated life, as we'll have occasion to say, and now he was dead. There was an inquest called. The three men stayed in the room for the police to arrive. The police did arrive. There was an inquest into the murder, and the three men all agreed that it wasn't their fault that Christopher Marlowe had begun an argument about the bill, the reckoning, as it was called. And in the course of the argument, he attacked one of the men in the room, and in the scuffle afterwards, Marlowe wound up with a knife stuck in his eye. The inquest finding was that it was self-defense, and therefore the three men were released and lived happily ever after. At least so the story goes. It's a more complicated story than that, as we'll have occasion, I think, to say.
Yes, as we will find out that Marlowe often came close to violence and crime. But let's begin by looking at the background to his life, the cultural context. So this is the late Elizabethan age, which often has been sentimentally reimagined as a kind of, a golden era of merry England. Stephen, you describe it as nightmarish.
Yes, I lived for many years in California, and I used to go in Northern California to something called the Renaissance Pleasure Fair in a beautiful grove of trees, of redwood trees, and we would drink mulled wine and have fun and sing songs and imagine that Shakespeare's world was a delicious, happy world of nymphs and fairies and the wonderful Virgin Queen herself, the glory days of old England. In fact, as I tried to make clear, as I think is clear from the surviving historical records, it was, as Lucy quotes me saying, a nightmare, more like North Korea than the Northern England or North Carolina, more like Iran, contemporary Iran, a world of, perhaps more like my country is becoming, a world of oppression, of fear, of anxiety, of persecution, of police arriving in the middle of the night. And it was a world in which it was best to keep your head down if you want to keep your head on. And Marlowe entered that world, was born into that world in 1564, a world in which the culture had come, English culture had come almost to a stop. There was almost nothing being done because it was too frightening. The society had swung back and forth among different religious persuasions. It was dangerous. And into that world came this very peculiar, remarkable young man out of nothing. Probably if he were born into a glorious family, he would have learned to keep his head down himself. But he didn't keep his head down. He was the son of a poor cobbler in the town of Canterbury, and with a illiterate mother and probably illiterate father as well, and 3 illiterate sisters. And out of that world came this extraordinary life.
By, it seems, almost a sequence of miracles. So he got a scholarship to King's School in Canterbury, which still exists, doesn't it? And then went to Cambridge. It's almost impossible to explain how that happened, isn't it?
It is very strange. Someone born to a family like Marlowe's in that world was not expected to have an education beyond perhaps the most rudimentary ABCs. But Marlowe, for reasons we don't understand, was able to pass a quite difficult exam in Latin at the age of 14 to gain admission to this extremely fancy school where he got a very nice scholarship. My guess is, we don't know, but my guess is that one of the Anglican priests in the great cathedral in Canterbury saw this young boy who was very quick and very ambitious and a fast learner, and took him under his wing and taught him Latin. And Latin was the key that unlocked the educational system in this period.
And it wasn't just the key to the educational system, it sort of was the educational system, wasn't it? What scholars did was they learnt Latin. And of course, therefore, they were reading pagan texts, which would be propagating ideas which would have seemed very, very shocking.
Yes, there was an open secret in the Elizabethan schools, which was that on the one hand, everyone was told how to behave themselves, everyone was inculcated in Orthodox Christian belief, you were required to go to church on Sunday. If you didn't go, you were fined, to listen to sermons. But in school, if you were able to go to school, and if you learned this Latin, which was the language of the school, you were immersed in pagan classics, in sexy, violent, thrilling, transgressive works by Ovid, by Catullus, by Virgil, and it's, how should we say, most of the students probably found it unbelievably boring in a way that school is ordinarily thought to be boring by, especially if you're forced to do it against your will. But it's clear that Marlowe found it thrilling, and Marlowe understood that he was being immersed in school in a whole set of ideas about how to live a life, sexually, politically, in every single way that didn't correspond to what you were being told in Sunday school.
And Stephen, just for a moment, I want to take the spotlight off Marlowe and put it on you. You've been an academic, you're a scholar, you've been teaching students through most of your grown-up life, as well as writing a series of tremendously influential studies of Renaissance culture. And in this book, you write very movingly about the joy of scholarship and also the excitement as a teacher of finding a really brilliant young student whom you can encourage.
I mean, what we know actually relatively little, truth be told. I shouldn't admit this. We know relatively little about Marlowe's life because someone who comes from under the radar like that doesn't leave a lot of traces of himself, unlike the Duke of Buckingham, about whom Lucy has written a brilliant biography, but where there's an enormous amount of material. Here there's relatively little. But we know who Marlowe's schoolmaster was at that school. And he was a bachelor named John Gresham. And we also know something about this character, the schoolmaster, who had gone to Oxford. And what we know was because while Marlowe was at the school, after several years, the second year, this schoolmaster died. And they did a very, very careful inventory of all of his possessions. So he owned a ratty old coat, he owned some very modest clothes and hat, but he owned a lot of books. And the fascinating thing, again, the material is very strange, but the fascinating thing is that several of the books that were crucially important in Marlowe's life, including books that were actually risky to read in the period, happened to be in this man's library. Now, how should we say, cautious biographers, and maybe that's a wise thing to be here, have said that, well, a schoolmaster wouldn't have let a student into his library. But the library was right next door to the school. The door opened and there was the master's rooms. And I say as a teacher that when you encounter a student who is actually thrilled by what he or she is studying, when you finally reach someone and you feel the spark, it isn't to me so surprising that such a person would allow the student access. Marlowe was 15-year-old, 16-year-old at that point, allow access to the whole range of books that you have in your library. The reason this comes up is because, again, to jump forward in Marlowe's life, a very dangerous document was found late in Marlowe's life, just a month before he was murdered, in fact. And that document was a heretical document, a document that seemed to deny the divinity of Jesus. And no one knew where the document was from, where it came from, but it was said to be in Marlowe's hand. And it was only in the 20th century that someone found where it was from a book that was not in wide circulation, but lo and behold, the book was in his schoolmaster's library in Canterbury when he was a teenager. Is it so impossible that the schoolmaster would have let young Marlowe in to this world of free thinking, of transgression, of escape from the boundaries of the constrained life in which he and everyone in society was living?
And Stephen, can you give us a picture of Marlowe's personality? As a schoolboy and then as a student, you use words like reckless, daring, and one of the contemporaries describes him as being very sudden.
Yes, one word that is repeated over and over again, often as a way of explaining why you would actually hang out with someone like Marlowe, who was saying things that were regarded as outrageous, was that he would say them so suddenly I couldn't stop him. So he was evidently, at least if you believe these accounts, someone who would blurt out things that other people weren't allowed to say, or weren't encouraged, let's put it that way, to say. This is a dangerous world. So Marlowe was quick. He was obviously a quick study. You can't learn, even if you're very quick, you can't learn Latin and Greek overnight. But he clearly was an unusually good student. And from his school, his grammar school in Canterbury, he won, as Lucy has already said, another scholarship to go to Cambridge University. Again, very unusually for someone who was from his social background, and he did go to Cambridge University officially, as it were, to study to become a priest in the Anglican Church. And it's probably fair to say that Marlowe would have been the least likely priest in the Anglican Church that you could possibly find. He's a very dangerous fellow.
Yes. And one of the outrageous things he is reported as having said was that St. John was Jesus Christ's Alexis. Can you explain what that means?
Evidently, he said a number of things, many things that you weren't supposed to say, but one of them, as Lucy has just said, was that he said that Jesus loved John, St. John, with an extraordinary love, that's his phrase, and that John was in effect, his lover. Now, if you wanted to live a long, happy life in Elizabethan England, you didn't suggest that Jesus had a homosexual lover in St. John. But that was only one of the things that Christopher Marlowe, according to the police report, actually multiple police reports, because at the end of his life, the state was interested in things he was saying and had spies collecting things writing them down that supposedly he was saying. That was only one of the things that he was saying. Why? Because he wanted to, because he was desperate to, because he was trying to provoke something. That's the question, one of the questions that hovers over this extraordinary life.
Yeah, so a dangerous person to be friends with. But at some point in his life at Cambridge, he was recruited by the Secret Service.
We think so. Something happened, something peculiar happened. He was a student, he got his undergraduate degree, his BA degree in Cambridge, and he went through the course of study that Cambridge undergraduates did. He lived in that peculiar world, the world of universities in which the children of the poor, if they were there, as Marlowe was there on a scholarship, mingled with the children of the rich and the aristocrats. That was a kind of, as universities are even today, this world in which social boundaries, at least temporarily, collapse and people meet across distant social worlds. So Marlowe lived in, and likewise in a world in which Catholics and Protestants, secret Catholics and secret radical Protestants could meet together along with the people who were more orthodox in their beliefs. So Marlowe was in that world as an undergraduate. And then he applied for and received a scholarship to continue to get an MA degree. And that was the confirmation of the fact that he was preparing for the Anglican priesthood. That's why you got such a degree. And then at the end of his MA studies, he applied for his degree, certificate of degree, and the university said no. You can't get, we're not giving you a degree because you haven't fulfilled the residence requirement. You are absent for long periods of time. And this actually can be confirmed because the university kept something called buttery books in which they recorded the students' daily consumption of beer and food. So you can go through the buttery books and see that Marlowe was missing for actually very long periods of time during his MA years. And the Cambridge authorities said it was suspected that he had gone to France where dissident English Catholics, Catholicism was illegal at that point in England, where dissident English Catholics were being trained to be smuggled back into the country to be terrorists. So that was the argument. And then a month passed. Marlowe didn't get his degree, must have been rather unhappy. A month passed, and a letter arrived that survives in London in the archives. And it was sent by the Queen's Privy Council, that is to say, the most important people, most powerful people in the realm, who signed a letter saying Her Majesty would be unhappy if someone who has done the state such important service as Christopher Marlowe not receive his degree. Give him his degree. And he got his degree. But you can be certain that there are very few letters sent from the Queen's principal officers on behalf of a cobbler's son from a provincial town if this cobbler's son hadn't been recruited to do something important for the regime. And it was a time in which, this is 1586, 87, the time in which the noose is being tightened around the neck of Mary, Queen of Scots, who is under house arrest, and in which the English state is incredibly anxious about terrorism. And Marlowe was clearly recruited to be part of that world, working for a man named Francis Walsingham, who was the Queen's spymaster, operating out of his office, his home office, on a place called Seething Lane in London. Only in England could you make up names like Seething Lane for the spy service.
And this was part of the nightmarish culture that we talked about earlier, the sense that everyone was being watched. And the spy network overseen by Walsingham was very pervasive, wasn't it? Very powerful and very frightening. But so we know, because of that extraordinary letter, that Marlowe became involved. We don't quite know how, to begin with anyway. But then he left Cambridge with his MA, and he went up to London, and he wrote his first play, Tamburlaine not his first play, he'd written Dido and Aeneas, hadn't he, but his first big successful play, Tamburlaine the Great. Can you tell us about that amazing play?
So you have this strange life turn. He doesn't become a priest. That is no surprise, at least if you look at the life from this angle. But that he did this other, there were very few other things perhaps that he could do, but he doesn't go back to Canterbury. He doesn't go back to be a shoemaker with his father. He goes to London, and lo and behold, almost immediately after he goes to London from Cambridge, he writes a play which is performed and is a huge popular success. It's like, what? The Godfather. It pleases everyone. It excites everyone. There's an actor becomes tremendously famous named Ned Allen, who performs the part of Tamburlaine. It's a play that is an extraordinary breakthrough. It changes the nature of Elizabethan theater forever. Why does it change the nature of Elizabethan theater? Partly because it's a crazily transgressive play, in the sense it's about a nobody, a shepherd, who conquers most of the known world and has kings at his feet and marches around and captures the daughter of the Sultan of Egypt and captures her and kidnaps her, and she falls in love with him. And it ends happily, which is absurd. Someone who breaks all the rules, who comes from nothing, who destroys the legitimate rulers of the world and ends happily at the end of the play. So that's part of its magical effect. But perhaps more importantly, it's written in an extraordinary way. Elizabethan plays were written in verse, largely. People used to go in the period and talk about going to hear a play, not see a play. But the verse form that was in place when Marlowe came on the scene was a verse form called 14ers, 14-syllable lines, long lines. And it actually can sound okay. Amazing grace, how sweet a sound that saved a wretch like me. That's a 14er. But Marlowe invented a new way of writing for the stage. He borrowed it actually from the early 16th century, but it hadn't been used for the stage, called blank verse, iambic pentameter. And what blank verse is a way of sounding like you're speaking English, but as if you were much more eloquent than you could possibly be in real life. Nature that framed us of four elements, warring within our breasts for regiment, doth teach us all to have aspiring minds. That's Tamburlaine. It makes perfect sense as an English sentence, but it sounds like it's been turned up in its energy. And that, after Marlowe did that in Tamburlaine, virtually everyone who writes for the theater in this period writes in blank verse, and above all, an exact contemporary of Marlowe, also a provincial who comes to London and is trying to break into the theater and learn how to do it, namely William Shakespeare, starts writing, learns from Marlowe, and starts writing in this form, blank verse.
We had to get to Shakespeare. And indeed, it happens. The two of them find themselves collaborating. How did that happen?
Marlowe was a big success, as I say. He's as young as many of you in this audience. He's in his early 20s. He's had this extraordinary breakthrough, and he's done it for a whole new phenomenon, which is a relatively new phenomenon, which is the popular English theater, the public theater. It's a commercial enterprise, a highly competitive commercial enterprise. You have to get 3,000 people into the space of the theater in an afternoon to spend their pennies to go away, not to work, but to leave their work and go and listen to entertainment in the afternoon. And the theaters are competing with each other, so they need a lot of material. And an entrepreneur who's got Marlowe to write Tamburlaine obviously wanted to have more of the same. First, he gets Marlowe to write a second part of Tamburlaine, and then he evidently recruited Marlowe to collaborate with another young, ambitious provincial playwright, namely Shakespeare, on a history play, a play about the Wars of the Roses. And those are Shakespeare's early plays Henry VI. It used to be thought that the Henry VI plays, which I know you will all know by heart, already the Henry VI plays were written only by Shakespeare, but they are actually now widely understood to have been written by Shakespeare and Marlowe together. So at a certain point, probably quite early, the two of them come together and start working together. And they must have found in many ways lots in common, because Shakespeare is the son of a glover from Stratford, Marlowe the son of a cobbler from Canterbury. Neither of them has that kind of fancy background, but Marlowe had degrees from Cambridge University. Shakespeare didn't go to university. Marlowe is the more prestigious character in that way, but Shakespeare is the person who has learned actually multiple times, but from Marlowe, how to do something. And poor Marlowe, a genius that he was, Shakespeare actually does it better. And that is actually Marlowe's fate, to leap ahead hundreds of years to ourselves. The reason that we wouldn't have had to introduce you to Shakespeare, but we do have to introduce you to Christopher Marlowe, is that Shakespeare learned how to do things from Marlowe, and always that was generally true. No matter whom he imitated, he does it even better. But Marlowe writes The Jew of Malta, Shakespeare writes Merchant of Venice. Marlowe writes Tamerlane, Shakespeare writes Richard III. Marlowe writes Doctor Faustus, Shakespeare writes Hamlet. Marlowe's achievements are not negligible, they're magnificent, but Shakespeare manages to turn it up even higher.
And so you talked about the form.
There are Shakespeare enthusiasts, as I am myself.
But so Tamburlaine, blank verse, the formal qualities of Marlowe's drama are thrilling. But it's also, it's very violent, very shocking. The scenes that people remember from Tamburlaine are when Tamburlaine shuts the emperor in a cage, and then another scene when he harnesses some captive kings to his chariot so that he's using them as beasts of burden to draw his cart. These are very shocking images. And you talked about the fact that Tamburlaine was initially a mere shepherd, and this rising from kind of nowhere to supreme power is obviously something that resonated immensely with Marlowe.
It resonated with Marlowe, and for the obvious reasons, but it also resonated for his audience. The Elizabethan audience was not an audience only of the rich and privileged. The whole economics of the Elizabethan stage depended upon bringing large numbers of people from the lower social classes as well as from the elite into the theater. And perhaps for that reason, it's not surprising that Marlowe's successes tend to be plays about nobodies who conquer the world, about outsiders, about the despised, a Jew, Barabbas, who manages to become the ruler of Malta before he is actually done in, a gay courtier who becomes the lover of the king, a person born of nobody, base of stock, who becomes a famous magician. One play after another of Marlowe's, these plays are about people who break through the social barrier and who violate the rules of a hierarchical society. And clearly that thrilled the thousands of people who come to the theater, and Marlowe pushes it out right to the limit. Shakespeare also learned how to push it, but Shakespeare actually was good at not being murdered at the age of 29. He was quite clever at it. He wanted to stay out of prison, but it wasn't because he was a coward. It was because he actually found ways of saying what he wanted to say without being right out with Marlowe at the edge of the precipice. Shakespeare has a character say, "A dog's obeyed in office." A dog's obeyed in office. Thoughts that actually Americans can have at the moment quite easily. And but he says it safely because it's a crazy person who's saying it, King Lear. Or Shakespeare has a character say, it's a heretic that makes the fire, not she that burns in it. If you said that in a tavern in Elizabethan England, you'd be a dead man. But Shakespeare has a character say that. But it's a woman with a loud, a rather crazy woman, Paulina, in The Winter's Tale, witch-like woman. So Shakespeare figures out how to release this pent-up energy without winding up dead. But Marlowe, for whatever reason, doesn't find that space. Marlowe makes the way, smashes through the boundaries, but at the cost of his own life.
And he creates a kind of a moral universe. Actually, no, scratch that. An immoral universe, amoral universe. So Tamburlaine, who has done, we've seen him doing terrible things. He's a vicious, sadistic, cruel, irrational character. And then Marlowe gives him a happy ending. It's as though that there is no judgment. And if there's no judgment, then maybe there's no God up there to do the judging. It's a frightening vision, isn't it?
Yes. In the second part of Tamburlaine, Marlowe does, to give him credit, have Tamburlaine die. But he just dies the way, alas, we'll all die. He gets sick, and he dies. But he's lived a long life, and he dies actually threatening God. He says, now I'm going to go up and defeat you. He reaches up to the heavens. But Marlowe finds in each of the plays a space for violating the official rules. Why he's doing this, how he's doing this, well, he didn't do it for a long time. He did it for a short life. But in what spirit he did it, that's not so easy to say. Because, after all, we said at the beginning, he's working for the spy service. At least for some of his life, he's working for the spy service. And here's a question I don't have an answer for, and you probably don't either. If you sign up for the spy service, can you quit? Can you say, I'm no longer a spy, actually, I don't want to do this anymore, and get away with it? It's not clear. It's not clear what Marlowe is doing when he moves to London after graduating from university. It's not clear whether he's ever far away from the spy service. And it happens that in that scene with which we began in Deptford, in that tavern in Deptford when he dies, who are these people whom he's having his happy day with and whom he's arguing with about the bill at the end? Well, lo and behold, they're all connected in some way or other to the spy service. Maybe, as Marlowe's most cautious biographers say, it's just an accident, those are the people he knew. But I don't think so. I think that it was much more difficult to get out than it was to get in the late 16th century. And I think that actually if we look hard at Marlowe's plays, we see traces of that situation, of what it means to get in and find yourself in a world from which there's no escape.
When you sell your soul, which brings us to his most famous play, Doctor Faustus. Since some of these people may not know the story, can you give us the outline?
There was a piece of popular literature that originated in Germany in the middle of the 16th century about a notorious German magician named Georg Faust, who evidently appears to have been a real person, though it's actually, these matters are always obscure and difficult, but someone who was traveling around parts of Germany doing, in effect, magic tricks that he was claiming he had received from the devil and making some money at it. And that work, his life was written up in a book called the Faust Book that is a kind of joke book, no better than maybe it should be, about how this person, Georg Faust, managed to acquire his magical powers by making a deal with the devil. And Marlowe evidently came upon this book, and he turned it into what is in effect the first great Elizabethan tragedy. And what remains, though the text is very corrupted now, unfortunately, a good text doesn't survive of it, but remains in its core one of the really great plays from the whole Elizabethan period, one of the few plays that actually rivals Shakespeare's own tragedies in its power, about a young scholar, a university-trained scholar, a professor, who feels that he's reached the end of his capacity to feel pleasure in his intellectual work, who feels he's exhausted his study of medicine, his study of law, his study of theology, who longs for something else, who has a craving to understand secrets in the universe, and who conjures up the devil, a devil called Mephistopheles, and sells his soul to the devil in order to acquire something, riches, sex, knowledge that he had been denied before, but only at the cost of selling his soul and of signing up for a limited life, 24 years in the case of Marlowe's Doctor Faustus, at the end of which he knows he'll die. So that's the play. The play has some, as I say, the text is corrupted, and some of it is tedious, much of it is still incredibly powerful. It's one of Marlowe's plays that can still be done successfully, and it's about having made an agreement, done something in your life from which there's no escape, something that gives you something you long for, access to people, access to things, access, as I say, to sex, but maybe above all, access to secret knowledge, but at a high cost. And it's at least part of at the very center, really, of the argument of the book that I've written, that Marlowe, in writing this extraordinary play, is reaching back into whatever happened when he was recruited at Cambridge to do whatever it was that he did to his friends, with his friends, with his own life, and the feelings that he carried with him as the time that he had to live began to tick through. And he's able to draw upon that to create this extraordinary character of Dr. Faustus.
It's an incredibly powerful play. And of course, in writing it and describing the character of Faustus, Marlowe was able to draw on the characters of people he knew in the real world, Sir Walter Raleigh, and the people like John Dee, the Wizard Earl of Northumberland. Can you tell us a bit more about those characters?
Yes, absolutely. One of the, how should we say, one of the things that Marlowe got from the decisions that he made in life was access to extraordinary people, the most, in a way, remarkable and in many ways dangerous people in his world. Again, this is unlike almost anyone else, including Shakespeare. There's a record, there's a man named John Aubrey who was a kind of gossip collector in the 17th century who tried to find out, after Shakespeare had died, some information about Shakespeare. And he was told that when Shakespeare was invited out in the evening for a debauch, as Aubrey says, he would say, "I have a headache, I can't go out tonight, I don't feel well." That he wasn't Aubrey said he was told that Shakespeare was not a company keeper. And that actually is characteristic of Shakespeare's life, I think, that Shakespeare doesn't have a set of extraordinary, as far as we know, extraordinary connections with all the most important people in his world. He could observe them from a distance, but he kept a distance. Marlowe, on the other hand, enters into, finds a way, this nobody from the provincial town, we know from the spies reports, becomes part of the circle around Sir Walter Raleigh. What was thought at a certain point to be called the School of Night, the dangerous free thinkers of the late 16th century, and also the 9th Earl of Northumberland. How do we know this? Marlowe, one of the weird episodes in Marlowe's life was that he was in the Netherlands just the year before he was murdered, and he was accused of counterfeiting. Evidently, he was trying to counterfeit coins. No one really can explain the story adequately. In those days, if you were accused of counterfeiting and you were found to be a counterfeiter, there was no very elaborate routine, legal routine. You were just strung up from the nearest tree. And Marlowe was not strung up from the nearest tree. He was taken to the military governor, English military governor of the town, and he said, I am a scholar, and I'm very well known to the 9th Earl of Northumberland and to Lord Strange, who was going to be the Earl of Derby. These are hugely important, wealthy, powerful people. And so the military governor was afraid to kill him there and then and sent him back with his hands tied to London to verify this crazy claim that this nobody knows the most important people in England. And they freed him. They let him go because evidently he was well known to these people. So this is the world that he moved in. It was a shark tank, but it was a glamorous shark tank. And he managed to survive in it for several years before that day he spent in Deptford.
So he was involved with these people they were scholars, they were researchers, they were scientists, but they were also dabbling in magic and wizardry. Very dangerous. And there's another very dangerous strand to Marlowe's life, which we haven't really touched on yet, sex. So should we move on to Edward II, where he describes the love of a man for another man?
Sex is a dangerous strand in many people's lives, Lucy, as we know. It is, for Christopher Marlowe, there's, from very early on in his life, and not only in the rash remarks he made about Jesus, but in the plays and poems that he wrote, there's very strong evidence that his sexual orientation was what now we would call homosexual, but that word wasn't in use in the period, and in fact the whole concept of being a homosexual was not part, as you know as the author of the book on Buckingham, that isn't the way people thought about same-sex desire. You have a very strange situation in England, but it's not unheard of in the world. On the one hand, you have very strict laws on the books against what they call sodomy. On the other hand, you have a kind of don't ask, don't tell world. Officially, sodomy is a capital offense. You can be executed for it. How many people are executed for sodomy between the time they passed the bill under Henry VIII and all the way through, let's say, to the middle of the 17th century? 0. Now, either you can believe that everyone was chaste completely in this period, and so miraculously no one had to be accused, or you can think that that's the way the game is being played, is that no one can accuse anyone else because actually, basically, we know how human beings are. All human beings behave the way human beings almost always behave. And in the case of Marlowe and a small number of other people, Francis Bacon, we know that the principal sexual choice is same-sex. The trouble with Marlowe is he doesn't follow the don't ask, don't tell rule. He writes a play, Edward II, that's very explicit about homosexuality. Toward the end of his life, he's writing a poem, Hero and Leander, that's extremely explicit about homosexual desire. He evidently was saying, as we've seen, things that you don't say if you want to live a long life. And he isn't saying them, he's saying them, as it were, unusually openly and even lovingly about a form of love that he was not willing to deny for himself, even though it was officially absolutely necessary to deny it. And that actually, in some ways, is characteristic of this person's life, an unwillingness to be silent about things that you were meant to be silent about.
And so that recklessness takes him to that room in Deptford where we began. And now I'm going to ask you a completely impossible question, which you can't possibly answer. But so he was only 29, he'd only just begun. What do you think he might have written? Which way would his talent have led him had he been given? I mean, Shakespeare had another quarter century to go at that age, didn't he?
Yes, it's a remarkable and remarkable life that went from writing Tamburlaine at the beginning to writing a succession of plays, each one quite different, each one exploring a different territory of human existence, each one transgressive in its way, but transgressive in a different direction. And the late plays, late in the sense of this very young man's life, Doctor Faustus, and a play that only survives in a very partial way, The Massacre at Paris, these are moving in very different directions. So could he have had a career like Shakespeare's? He would certainly have done more things, more remarkable things. I think the most beautiful thing he was doing at the end of his life is that long epic poem, Hero and Leander, an incredibly beautiful poem about love, including accepting homosexual love as well as heterosexual love. I think that if Marlowe could have developed that part of himself, he might have got beyond something that I hope I've made clear. I love Christopher Marlowe and I admire him, but there's a streak of cruelty in him that he needed to work through. One of the things that's very striking, I think, about the difference between Shakespeare and Marlowe, I think Shakespeare hated cruelty beyond anything. Marlowe has a streak of cruelty in him. I think he couldn't have lived the life he had without it. And I think that he would have had, if he were to develop further as an artist, he would have had to work through and get to the other side of that cruelty. And if he had been able to do so, then of course, anything would have been possible. He would have been able to write his version of King Lear or The Tempest, but he didn't do it.
And so in the end, the violence that he'd celebrated in his drama caught up with him and killed him. Now, I apologize, there isn't going to be any time for questions, but I'm not at all sorry because I wouldn't have missed anything that Stephen has been saying. So thank you very much, and let's applaud.
Thank you all. Thank you.